Video 60 of the Master Course Quantum Chemistry of Molecular Electromagnetic Properties. The topic of this lecture is a short review of electronic structure methods. Before we're going to look at approximate quantum chemical methods for calculating the molecular properties which we have introduced in part 2 of the book, we need to introduce some of the quantum chemical methods and in particular the notation, which we are going to use in the following chapters 10, 11, and 12. So here in chapter 9, we will discuss or introduce different quantum chemical methods, approximate quantum chemical methods, and we will discuss how the energy and the unperturbed wave functions are calculated in these methods and how the expression for the wave functions look like in the absence of perturbations. This is by no means going to be an exhaustive list of quantum chemical methods. We will only discuss or introduce the methods which are later on used in the chapters 10, 11, and 12. Now, since we're going to look at the energies and the wave function in the absence of the external electromagnetic perturbations, meaning the unperturbed wave functions throughout this chapter, I'm going to drop the superscript zeroth order now, meaning identifying the unperturbed wave functions now for the energies and the wave function in this chapter. I will only keep it for in the Hamiltonian, where I want to express the field-free Hamiltonian. The different approximate wave functions in this chapter will be indicated by the symbol capital Phi to show clearly that it's an approximation to the exact unperturbed wave function, which I identify by psi instead of. Common for all the approximate wave functions in this chapter is that they can be expressed as a linear combination of Slater determinants with some coefficients capital Cn. So the capital C are the coefficients in the expansion of a wave function, a many electron wave function in Slater determinants, and should be distinguished from molecular orbital coefficients, for which I use a small c as a symbol. I will also assume that the approximate wave functions, phi 0 and the other ones, are assumed to be properly normalized. Now, a Slater determinant is nothing else than just an antisymmetride product of spin orbitals. And the Slater determinant is just a convenient way to produce all the permutations of the spin orbitals which are necessary to make the wave function antisymmetric under permutations of the indices of electrons. Now, a spin orbital, for which I will use the symbol small psi, small because it's a one electron function, and psi because it's a spin orbital. So a spin orbital is a product of a spatial molecular orbital, for which I will use the symbol small phi. And the spatial orbital is a function of the three space coordinates x, y, z, which are used for identifying the position of an electron. And in order to get the spin orbitals, one has to multiply the spatial molecular orbital with one of the two spin functions, either alpha spin, which corresponds to spin up, meaning it corresponds to a value of the quantum number of ms, which is equal to +1/2, and the second spin function beta, which is spin down, or ms minus equals to -1/2. Now s is the abstract spin variable, and x is the x here written as a vector, as a 4-component vector, is the spatial position vector r with the x, y, z component and the spin variable together. Now, in restricted methods, which we are going to look at in this chapter, one uses the same spatial orbital for both the alpha spin and the beta spin orbitals. That's different in unrestricted methods, but here we will only discuss restricted methods where we use the same spatial orbital for both spin orbitals. These spatial molecular orbitals, phi, are expanded in a set of other known functions, one electron functions, for which we use the symbol chi, and Greek indices. And this set of functions is typically called a basis set. Sometimes we can also call them atomic orbitals, although the functions do not have to be placed at the positions of the nuclei. Now, so the molecular orbitals are expanded in this set of basis functions chi, which means they are a linear combination of the basis functions with some coefficients, here c mu p. And these coefficients, for which I use a small c in contrast to the coefficients from the expansion of the many electron wave function into Slater determinants, these coefficients c mu p are called the molecular orbital coefficients. In many of the expressions for the energies in the following chapters, we will encounter the so-called two-electron repulsion integrals, here written over spatial orbitals, which are integrals over two electrons. So we have a double integration over the position of two electrons, and they have four spatial orbitals. And as the operator here, we have the electron-electron repulsion operator. So it's the electron-Coulomb interaction between two electrons. And we will use them in what is called the chemical notation or molecular notation, where in the first part of this expression here, we have the two spatial orbitals which describe electron 1, where the first one, as one can see here, is the complex conjugate one, and the second one is non-complex conjugate. The bar in the middle actually just indicates that we have this Coulomb operator. And then in the second half of this expression, we have the two spatial orbitals used for electron 2, where again the first one, phi j here, is complex conjugate. Now, since these spatial molecular orbitals are expanded in this linear combination of basis functions or atomic orbitals with these expansion coefficients, they're called molecular orbital coefficients, therefore also the spin orbitals depend are a function of these molecular orbital coefficients, and because the Slater determinants are antisymmetrized products of spin orbitals, therefore then also, of course, the Slater determinants depend on these molecular orbital coefficients. And the general many electron wave function, or the approximate many electron wave function which we're going to use, they, in addition to the dependence of the Slater determinants on the molecular orbital coefficients, they will also depend on this capital C, the expansion coefficients of the Slater determinants. So the different methods we are going to look at, they will differ by the way how one determines these Slater determinant coefficients, and maybe also how one determines the molecular orbital coefficients. And we will distinguish between so-called variational and non-variational methods. For the case of the variational methods and hard-to-fork or in general self-consistent field methods and the multi-configuration self-consistent field methods or the full configuration interaction methods, CI, for those methods, it holds that the energy is calculated as an expectation value. An expectation value where here we have our approximate wave function that could be an SCF, an MCSCF, or full CI wave function in the bra and in the cat, and we have of course the full, in our case now, unperturbed Hamilton operator in the middle. And the wave function parameters, both the molecular orbital coefficients as well as the coefficients of the determinants, they are obtained variationally, means they are obtained in such a way that the energy here becomes a minimum. And that means one determines them by requiring that the derivative of the energy with respect to these determinant coefficients as well as to the molecular orbital coefficients is equal to 0, which means we have a stationary point. This is in contrast to the non-variational methods like Möller-Blessed perturbation theory or couple cluster theory, where the energy is calculated as an asymmetric expectation value, also sometimes called a transition expectation value, which means that the wave function in the ket and in the bra differ. So we have a different wave function here in the bra, therefore I write capital phi 0 prime, than we have in the ket. And the expansion coefficients for the determinants then are not obtained variationally, not obtained by requiring that the derivative of the energy with respect to all these coefficients is zero, but they are obtained by projecting the Schrödinger equation, where we use this wave function as our approximate wave function, that this Schrödinger equation is projected against some of the determinants. And in the case of, and in particular, it's not an arbitrary determinant, but it's the determinant which coefficient we want to determine. So in order, we insert this wave function in the Schrödinger equation and then project the whole Schrödinger equation against the determinant which coefficient we want to determine. The molecular orbital coefficients, they are actually obtained variational, but variational at the level of just one Slater determinant wave function, so-called Hartree-Fock or self-consistent field level. There the molecular orbitals coefficients are obtained by requiring that the Hartree-Fock or self-consistent field energy actually is a minimum. In the following chapter, we will look now at those different methods, starting with Hartree-Fock and all the other ones which I have mentioned here.